She betrayed her twin for the inheritance, but 3 months later, what she found in the children's room shocked everyone. Chapter 1. The diagnosis: the Whitmore estate sat on the edge of Meadowbrook Hill like a crown jewel, 3 stories of white-columned grace, surrounded by magnolia trees that Jessica Whitmore Hale had planted herself the year her twins were born. That was 11 years ago. Back then, everything felt permanent, solid, untouchable. Now, sitting in the cold leather chair across from Dr. Raymond Osai, Jessica felt as though the floor beneath her had quietly dissolved. Early-onset Alzheimer's. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Given your age, 44, and the rate of progression we're seeing in the scans, I want to be honest with you, Jessica. You have time. But the decisions you make in the next few months will matter more than any decision you've made before. Jessica didn't cry. She had never been the kind of woman who cried in public places. She straightened her blazer, crossed her ankles, and looked at the scan on the illuminated board as though she were reviewing a quarterly business report. How much time before the symptoms become visible to others, Doctor? Osai folded his hands. 12 to 18 months before daily function is significantly impaired. But memory disruptions, confusion, emotional unpredictability, those could begin in as little as 6 months. She drove home alone, the way she always did everything alone, quietly, efficiently. Her husband, Marcus, had died 3 years ago in a construction accident that took everything from the children before they were old enough to understand permanence. Since then, Jessica had been both parents, both pillars, both the storm and the shelter for her 10-year-old son, Daniel, and her 9-year-old daughter, Grace. She couldn't let the illness take them too. That evening, Jessica stood at the kitchen window watching Daniel help Grace with her bicycle in the back garden. He was patient with her, impossibly patient for a boy his age, steadying the handlebars while Grace giggled and wobbled. The magnolia trees swayed above them like gentle witnesses. Who will do that when I can't? The thought arrived not with grief, but with something sharper, something strategic, because that was the moment Jessica Whitmore Hale remembered her twin sister, Janet. Janet Whitmore had always been the opposite of Jessica: louder, sharper-edged, magnetic in the way that dangerous things often are. They had grown up in the same house, worn the same face, shared the same DNA, and yet managed to become entirely different species of human being. Where Jessica built things, a business, a home, a family, Janet dismantled them, quietly and methodically, always with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Their mother's will, 10 years ago, had left the Whitmore estate and its accompanying trust to Jessica. Janet had received a generous cash settlement, more than enough to build a comfortable life. But enough had never been a word in Janet's vocabulary. She had contested the will, lost, smiled through the loss, and begun the long, slow performance of being a devoted sister. Jessica had watched it all. She had let Janet perform, and she had filed every performance carefully away. Now, standing at the kitchen window, watching her children laugh in the golden September light, a plan formed in Jessica's mind with the cold, precise clarity of a chess master studying a board. She would test Janet. Completely. Finally. Irreversibly. The family dinner was planned for the following Saturday. Jessica called it a reconnection evening, something she occasionally organized to maintain the illusion of family warmth that the children deserved. Janet arrived in a cream-colored wrap dress, carrying an expensive bottle of wine she had almost certainly expensed to the small consulting firm she barely ran. Janet's embrace was the practiced kind, firm enough to seem genuine, brief enough to remain comfortable. "You look tired." "I know I do," Jessica thought. "I spent 3 days making sure of it. The dinner table was set with white candles and the good china. Daniel talked about his science project, something involving weather patterns and barometric pressure. Grace showed Janet a drawing she had made of their mother, framed in flowers. Janet admired it with the correct amount of warmth, holding it at arm's length, tilting her head. Jessica watched all of it from behind steady eyes. Then, at precisely 8:14 in the evening, between the main course and dessert, Jessica Whitmore Hale put down her fork, pressed 2 fingers to her temple, and slowly, with the controlled artistry of a woman who had rehearsed for 4 days in front of her bathroom mirror, allowed herself to fold. The chair scraped. Her water glass toppled. She hit the floor with a sound that brought Daniel to his knees beside her in an instant, his small hands on her face, his voice cracking through the syllables of "Mom, Mom." "Wake up, Grace," was screaming. And Janet stood at the edge of the table, wine glass still in hand, face a perfect mask of shock. But Jessica, through the narrow performance of unconsciousness, had kept her eyes open just enough, just a fraction, to see what crossed her sister's face in the half-second before concern arrived. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. A fast, flickering, electric recalibration, the kind of look a person gives when a door they didn't know existed suddenly swings open in front of them. Jessica let her eyes close fully. She let the ambulance come. She let the doctors run their tests. She let Janet hold her hand in the hospital corridor at midnight, squeezing it with perfect tenderness while Daniel and Grace slept in the waiting room chairs with their coats as blankets. "I'm here," Janet whispered. "Whatever you need, Jess. I'm here." "I know you are," Jessica thought. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." 3 days later, Jessica sat across from her attorney, Mr. Franklin Acaffer, in his oak-paneled office on the 14th floor of the city's most discreet legal building. "I need to arrange a temporary transfer of household management authority," she said, "to my sister, Janet Whitmore, effective in the event of my incapacitation or absence." Franklin looked over his glasses. "Jessica, are you certain about this?" "I'm certain about what I need to discover." She placed a folder on his desk. "I also need you to arrange the safe house, the one we discussed, discreet, equipped within observation distance of the estate, and the documentation protocol, everything." Her voice was precise and quiet as a scalpel. "Every transaction, every decision, every conversation recorded through the household security system, which Janet doesn't know I upgraded last month." Franklin studied her for a long moment. "How long do you intend to be gone?" Jessica looked out the window at the city below, at the life still humming and moving, and completely unaware. 3 months, she said. Enough time for the truth to stop hiding. The night before she disappeared, Jessica did 4 things. First, she sat on the edge of Daniel's bed while he slept and memorized the exact angle of his jaw, the way his lashes rested against his cheek, the small scar above his eyebrow from the bicycle accident 3 summers ago. Second, she tucked a handwritten letter under Grace's pillow, sealed, marked "Open only when you feel most alone," and pressed her lips to her daughter's hair for a long, still moment. Third, she called Maria Santos, the family's housekeeper of 7 years, and told her only this: "No matter what happens in the next few months, do not leave unless you are left no choice. And when that day comes, and it will call this number." She pressed a card into Maria's hands. Maria, who had buried her own mother and raised her brothers, looked at Jessica with the particular understanding of a woman who has survived hard things. "I will protect them," Maria said simply. "I know," said Jessica. "That's why I'm telling you." Fourth and finally, Jessica walked through every room of the Whitmore estate alone, slowly, with her hand trailing the walls, the banisters, the door frames, as though memorizing the bones of the life she had built. The children's artwork framed in the hallway, the reading nook where she and Daniel spent Sunday mornings, the garden view from the kitchen window where Grace liked to watch the birds. Then she walked out a side door into the waiting car and disappeared. Chapter 2. The Betrayal. The safe house was a modest 2-bedroom apartment on Alderman Street, 12 minutes from the estate, anonymous behind its unremarkable beige curtains. Jessica had arranged it through a property management firm with no direct connection to her name. It was furnished simply: a desk, a laptop, 3 monitors connected to the estate's security system, and a single framed photograph of Daniel and Grace that she had taken in the garden last August. She settled in on a Tuesday morning, poured herself a coffee, and watched. Janet moved in on Friday. Jessica had sent the formal medical notification through Franklin's office, a carefully worded letter citing acute neurological episodes requiring specialist residential care, and granting Janet temporary guardianship of Daniel and Grace and management authority over the household. Janet had arrived at Franklin's office within 4 hours of receiving the letter. She didn't ask where Jessica was receiving treatment, Franklin reported during their first check-in call. She asked about account access. Jessica wrote that down. The children were told their mother was receiving medical care at a specialist facility. Daniel had cried quietly at school, according to his teacher, who had called to check in. Grace had stopped eating breakfast for 3 days. Maria Santos had sat with them every evening, reading to them, keeping the routines intact with the devotion of a woman who understood that structure is the language love speaks to grieving children. Then Janet arrived with 2 suitcases and a decorator. Day 4 of observation. Jessica watched on the monitor as Janet walked through the estate with a woman named Celeste introduced to the children as a family friend helping with some updates. Together, they moved through every room with clipboards and measuring tapes, discussing wall colors, furniture replacements, the possibility of converting Marcus's old study into a home office for Janet. Daniel stood in the hallway and watched them disappear into his father's study. His expression was the expression of a boy trying very hard to be older than 10. Jessica pressed her hand flat against the desk. Not yet, she told herself. Not yet. Day 9, Maria Santos was called to the sitting room at 9 in the morning. Janet sat in the high-backed armchair that had always been Jessica's position to face the door, the natural command position in the room. She was dressed formally, as though the conversation had been rehearsed. "Maria, I want to thank you for your years of service to this family," Janet began, in the tone of someone who had attended a workshop on difficult conversations. "But I've been reviewing the household budget, and I think it's time we made some adjustments." On the monitor, Jessica could see Maria's hands clasp in her lap. "I'll be taking on the primary role in managing the children's schedule directly," Janet continued. "I've arranged for a new agency to provide help on an as-needed basis. More efficient, more flexible." She paused. "Your contract will be honored through the end of the month." Maria did not change expression. "Does Mrs. Whitmore Hale know about this decision, A.B.?" Janet smiled. "Jessica has entrusted me with these decisions while she's recovering. I understand." Maria rose. "I'll need that in writing." It was a small act of precision in the face of an enormous unfairness. Jessica watched Maria walk calmly from the room and felt something fierce and tender rise in her chest. She picked up her phone and sent a single text to Maria's private number, the number on the card. "Use it tonight." When Maria called, Jessica answered on the first ring. "She's going to fire me," Maria said without preamble. "I know. I'm sorry. The children are being watched every moment." Jessica's voice was steady. "I need you to do one more thing before you go, Maria. I need you to place the small device I left in the 3rd kitchen drawer, the one in the blue case behind the bookshelf in the children's playroom." A pause. "Done." "And Mrs. Whitmore Hale?" "Yes. Grace put her mother's photograph under her pillow last night." Maria's voice held the careful weight of a woman not allowing herself to break. "She kisses it good night." Jessica sat with that for a long moment in the silence of the safe house, the monitors glowing blue in the dark room. "Thank you, Maria," she said finally. "For everything." Day 17, the estate's household account showed a withdrawal of $14,000 designated as renovation consulting fees for Celeste's firm. Jessica photographed the transaction record on her monitor and added it to the folder Franklin had labeled evidence. Financial Day 22. Janet placed a call from the house landline, not knowing the system recorded all calls to a man named Gregory Holt, who Jessica recognized as the attorney who had represented Janet during the failed will contest a decade ago. "The guardianship is clean," Janet said. Franklin's office signed off. "How long until we can move on the trust instrument?" Gregory's voice was cautious on the recording. "You can't touch the trust directly while the children are minors, but if the guardianship extends past 6 months and the medical incapacitation is formalized, it will be then you can petition for expanded financial oversight. It's not guaranteed, but with the right documentation I'll have the documentation." Jessica added the recording to the folder. Her hands were perfectly still. Day 31, Oliver Hale, Daniel's cousin and the child of Marcus's brother, had been awarded a university scholarship, a private fund that Jessica had quietly established through the estate 2 years ago to honor Marcus's memory. Oliver was 17, first in his family to go to university, studying engineering. Janet called the fund administrator on a Thursday afternoon. "This is Janet Whitmore, acting household manager for the Whitmore Hale estate. I'm reviewing all outgoing financial commitments, and I'll need to pause the Hale Scholarship disbursement pending a full audit." Pause for how long? Indefinitely, at this stage. On the monitor, Jessica watched Janet hang up, open her laptop, and begin browsing interior design websites. 45 seconds after potentially destroying a 17-year-old's future. 45 seconds. Jessica called Franklin. "Add the scholarship withdrawal to the documentation. And get me Oliver's contact information. I want to make sure he knows the funds haven't disappeared permanently." "Jessica." Franklin's voice held a rare note of emotion. "Are you all right?" She looked at the monitors, at the house she had built, at the screen showing Daniel's bedroom door, closed, Daniel inside, doing homework with no idea that his mother's carefully arranged world was being quietly dismantled around him. "I'm building a case," she said. "That's what I am right now." Day 38, Grace's birthday. Jessica had left a sealed box in the back of the kitchen pantry, behind the emergency candles, with a note attached in Maria's care. "For Grace's birthday. Make sure she gets this regardless of what has happened by then." Maria was gone by day 38, but she had, before leaving, told the new agency helper, a quiet woman named Ruth, exactly where the box was. Ruth, who had children of her own and a conscience that had not been included in her contract, retrieved the box that morning and placed it on the breakfast table with a pink ribbon. Janet entered the kitchen at 8:15, saw the box, and frowned. "Where did that come from?" Ruth said simply. "It was left for Grace." Grace came downstairs in her pajamas, still blinking with sleep, and stopped when she saw the box. She approached it slowly. "Read the tag for my Grace, who makes every room brighter. Happy birthday, my love." Mom and stood very still for a moment with the tag in both hands. Then she pressed it against her chest, eyes closed, the way children hold onto things they are afraid of losing. Janet watched this from across the kitchen island, and something passed across her face, not softness, not guilt, but something closer to irritation, as though the child's grief were an inconvenience in an otherwise organized schedule. In the safe house, 12 minutes away, Jessica watched this on the monitor and allowed herself, finally, to cry. Quietly, privately, with her hand over her mouth so the sound didn't escape the room. She cried for the 4 minutes it took Grace to compose herself and sit down at the breakfast table. Then she wiped her face, straightened, and wrote the date in the folder, day 38. Grace's birthday. The box delivered. The evidence is almost complete. Day 52. Janet held what she described to the children as a family meeting in the sitting room. "I've been thinking a lot about what's best for everyone," she told Daniel and Grace, who sat side by side on the sofa with the particular stillness of children who have learned that adult announcements at this level of formality are rarely good news. "And I think it would be wonderful for you both to spend the spring term at Reedwood Academy." Reedwood Academy was a boarding school, 200 miles away. Daniel looked at Janet with his father's eyes steady, measuring, older than his years. "Our mom chose Lakeside School for us," he said carefully. "She chose it because she wanted us close to home. Your mom is receiving care right now, sweetheart. She would want you to have the best. Then she would want us at Lakeside. She told us that." Daniel's voice didn't waver. "She told us specifically." Janet smiled the smile. "We'll discuss it more when you've had time to think." Ruth, standing in the doorway, noted the conversation in a text to the number Maria had passed along before leaving. Jessica added it to the folder, day 52. Boarding school attempt. Daniel held the line. Chapter 3. The return in the morning of day 91, 3 months and 1 week after Jessica Whitmore Hale had walked out the side door of her estate. Franklin Ockafer called Janet's cell phone and requested her presence at an urgent legal meeting regarding the Whitmore Hale Estate Trust. "There are some matters that require your signature and in-person review," Franklin said pleasantly. "My office has arranged for the meeting to be held at the estate itself for convenience." Would 11 a.m. work? Janet arrived at 10:52, 8 minutes early, the particular punctuality of someone who has been waiting for a meeting like this for 3 months. She was dressed in a structured charcoal blazer and heels that clicked decisively across the marble foyer. Gregory Holt, her attorney, arrived 2 minutes behind her. They took their seats in the formal dining room, where Franklin had arranged 2 chairs across a long table from a third chair that remained empty. The documents were thick. The coffee was hot. The morning light came through the tall windows in clean, golden bands. "We're waiting for one more party," Franklin said and checked his watch. Janet looked at the empty chair. "Who else is coming?" Before Franklin could answer, the front door opened. Jessica walked into her own home as though she had simply been away for the weekend. She wore a deep burgundy coat. Her hair was pulled back precisely. She carried a leather folder under her arm that was significantly thicker than anything on Franklin's table. Her footsteps were quiet, and even across the marble foyer, through the hallway lined with her children's artwork, and into the formal dining room. She set the folder on the table. She looked at her sister. Janet's face performed 3 expressions in approximately 2 seconds: shock, recalibration, and the beginning of a smile that was frantically assembled from whatever components were available. Her voice came out half a register too high. "We didn't know you were being released." "I wasn't released," Jessica said simply, pulling out the chair across from her sister and sitting down with the unhurried composure of a woman who has had 3 months to prepare for this exact moment. "I was never admitted anywhere." The silence in the room had weight. Gregory Holt looked at his client. Janet's assembled smile had developed a visible fracture along the left side. "I don't understand," Janet said. "Yes, you do." Jessica opened the leather folder. The first document she placed on the table was a printed transcript of the phone call between Janet and Gregory from day 22, with the relevant passages highlighted in yellow. "I've been listening for 3 months, Janet. From a safe house on Alderman Street, through a security system you didn't know had been upgraded." She placed the next document, the financial records. $14,000 in unauthorized renovation fees. Next. The scholarship withdrawal, a scholarship established in Marcus's name, for a child who did nothing to deserve being used as a financial instrument. Next. The boarding school discussions you held with my children without my knowledge or consent. She laid each document out with the calm, methodical precision of someone who has spent 3 months organizing pain into evidence. Janet found her voice. "Jessica, I can." Jessica looked at her sister across the table, looked at the face that was so nearly a mirror of her own, and yet had somehow arrived at such a different destination. Her voice, when she continued, was not angry. It was something quieter and more definitive. "I needed to know who you were when you thought I was gone, not who you performed being when I was watching, not the devoted sister at the dinner table. The real version. The one who moves into my house and dismantles my children's lives, and calls a lawyer about trust instruments before I've been gone 30 days. Janet opened her mouth. "I'm not finished." The room held its breath. "I have Alzheimer's," Jessica said. "That part was real. The diagnosis is real. The timeline is real. And the fear of what happens to my children when I am no longer able to protect them, that is more real than anything I have ever felt in my life." Her hands rested flat on the table, perfectly still. "And I needed to know whether I could trust you with them, whether against every instinct I had you had become someone who deserved that trust." She paused. "You answered that question thoroughly." From outside the dining room, there was a sound, the careful, soft sound of 2 children who have been listening from the hallway and who understand, with the particular clarity of children who have survived hard things, that something important is happening on the other side of a door. Jessica looked toward the sound for just a moment. Then she looked back at Janet and placed the final document on the table. "This is the formal revocation of your temporary guardianship and household management authority, prepared by Mr. Acaffer's office, effective immediately." She folded her hands. "And the 2 officers waiting on the front step are here because financial abuse of a dependent household, including the unauthorized diversion of a charitable scholarship, is a matter of legal record." Gregory Holt had been very quiet for the past several minutes. He leaned toward Janet now and said, in a low voice, "I strongly recommend against saying anything further." Janet looked at the documents on the table. She looked at her sister. For the first time in Jessica's memory, for the first time in 44 years of existing in parallel with this woman who wore her face, Janet Whitmore had absolutely nothing to say. The front door opened. The officers were professional and quiet. Janet left the house with her leather bag and her charcoal blazer, and the click of her heels across the marble foyer was smaller than it had been on the way in. Franklin gathered his papers. He looked at Jessica across the table with the expression of a man who has spent decades watching people navigate the worst circumstances of their lives and has not often seen it done quite like this. "It's done," he said. "Almost," said Jessica. She stood, buttoned her coat, and walked to the dining room doorway. Daniel and Grace were standing in the hallway. Grace had both hands pressed over her mouth. Daniel was doing the thing he always did, standing very straight, trying to process the size of the moment by being physically still within it. Jessica looked at them for a long, full moment. Then she opened her arms. Grace covered the distance between them at a full run, colliding with her mother at hip height and holding on with both arms and all of her weight. And the sound she made, the particular sound of a child who has been holding their breath for 3 months finally exhaling, was the only sound in the house. Daniel came more slowly, because that was Daniel's way. He wrapped his arms around his mother from the side, pressed his face against her shoulder, and said nothing, because he was 10 years old and the son of a man who had taught him, before he was old enough to remember being taught, that the things that matter most are sometimes beyond the reach of words. Jessica held them both and closed her eyes. "I'm home," she thought, "and I have work to do." Chapter 4. The resolution. The weeks that followed the confrontation moved with the particular texture of recovery, not quite celebration, not quite grief, but something in between. The careful, effortful work of rebuilding the ordinary after the extraordinary has passed through it. Maria Santos returned on the Monday after the confrontation, arriving at the front door at 7:55 a.m. with her work bag and a container of the Puerto Rican rice pudding she made when people needed comfort more than anything exotic. She said nothing about the 3 months. She simply walked into the kitchen, put on the coffee, and resumed exactly where she had left off, which is, of course, the highest form of loyalty. Oliver Hale received a call from Franklin's office confirming that the scholarship funds had been restored and that his spring enrollment at the engineering program was fully secured. He showed up at the estate on a Wednesday afternoon, stood on the doorstep looking exactly like a younger version of Marcus, and said, "I don't know what happened, but thank you," with the slightly overwhelmed sincerity of a 17-year-old who has just had the ground restored beneath his feet. Jessica made him tea and told him to study hard and not be too proud to ask for help when he needed it, which was the advice Marcus would have given him, and which she suspected Marcus would have been pleased to have delivered through her. Janet's legal situation was handled with the precision and privacy that Franklin's office was built for. The criminal proceedings for financial misappropriation were filed. The civil matter of the guardianship abuse was documented. Jessica did not speak publicly about any of it. When neighbors and extended family inquired, as they inevitably did, because the story had leaked at the edges the way all stories do, Jessica's response was consistent. "It's a family matter, and it's being handled appropriately." She felt no need to perform Janet's destruction. The evidence had done its work. The rest was the law's business. What concerned her now was something more urgent and more personal than justice. It started, as many of the best things in the Whitmore Hale household started, in the children's room. Specifically, it started on a rainy Saturday morning 3 weeks after the confrontation, when Jessica walked past the playroom and heard a conversation that stopped her in the hallway. "But what if she forgets us?" Grace's voice. Small and specific and aimed at the heart with the precision only children's questions achieve. A pause. Then Daniel. "She won't, but it's a brain thing. It makes you forget." "I know what it is." Another pause. Jessica stood in the hallway, hand resting on the doorframe, not yet ready to enter. "So what do we do?" Grace asked. Daniel's answer came slowly, as though he were assembling it carefully from available materials. "We remind her. That's what you do when someone might forget. You put the important things somewhere they can find them. Jessica stood in the hallway for a long moment after that. Then she walked past the playroom door, past the kitchen, all the way to her office at the end of the east wing and sat down at her desk. She opened her laptop. She stared at the blank document for a minute. Then she began to write. The memory archive, as it came to be known, first between Jessica and Franklin, then between Jessica and Maria, and finally between Jessica and the children themselves, was not a single thing. It was many things, accumulated over the following months with the determined, joyful urgency of a woman who has been told the clock is running, and has decided to treat that information as an invitation rather than a sentence. It began with letters, 43 of them, by the final count, one for every year of her life, plus one for each of the years ahead that she could imagine clearly. Letters for birthdays she might not be present for. Letters for the first day of high school, for graduation, for heartbreak, for the specific and irreplaceable moment each of them would face when the world showed them something they didn't expect, and they would need to know, viscerally and immediately, that someone had believed in them long before they had to believe in themselves. She wrote them at night, after the children were asleep, in the particular silence of the house that had always felt to her like the closest thing the living world offers to sacredness. She wrote them by hand, because she understood the way people who are losing something understand things with a specific clarity that her children would need the handwriting. The actual pen pressure, the looped *G*S, the places where the ink had run thick because she'd paused to think. The record of a living hand. She wrote Daniel's letters first. He was her worrier, her careful one, the child most likely to stand very still in the middle of a hard thing and try to think his way through it. She wrote to that quality, honored it, named it, told him the story of the time she had stood very still in a hard thing and found her way through. She told him about his father, specifically. The smell of Marcus's workshirts, the particular laugh he had when something delighted him, the way he could make anyone in a room feel like the most important person in it. She wrote it all down so that Daniel would have it when she couldn't give it to him verbally. Grace's letters came out differently, bigger, messier, full of drawings in the margins that Jessica did herself badly, with complete sincerity. Grace was the kind of child who received love best when it was slightly imperfect and very earnest, and so that was how Jessica wrote to her. She wrote about flowers. She wrote about the specific quality of light in the kitchen on Sunday mornings. She wrote about the way Grace had laughed, age 3, in a paddling pool in the back garden, with such complete and total physical joy that Jessica had stood there watching and felt, for the first and only time in her adult life, that she fully understood what the word abundance meant. The video recordings came next. It was Daniel who suggested them, with the practical directness he had inherited equally from both his parents. "Mom, you should record videos, so we can see your face and hear your voice whenever we need to." Jessica had borrowed a proper camera from the photography studio downtown. She had set it up in the sitting room on a Wednesday afternoon, with the magnolia trees visible through the window behind her, and the afternoon light coming in the way it did in September, warm, unhurried, forgiving. She had then sat in front of the camera for 11 minutes without pressing record. She had been trying to figure out the right way to begin. The formal version, "Hello, Daniel. Hello, Grace." The direct version, "There are things I need you to know." The honest version, the one where she simply looked into the lens and said, "I love you in a way I don't have good enough words for, and I am recording these because I want to make sure you always know that, regardless of what happens to my memory." She pressed record and said all three. Over the following weeks, she recorded 31 videos. Some were practical: how to negotiate kindly, how to change a tire, the recipe for the lamb stew Marcus had loved that she'd been making from memory for 20 years and had never written down. Some were philosophical in the way that mothers become philosophical when they are thinking about what they want to leave behind. What she believed about kindness, about work, about the specific kind of courage required to tell the truth to someone you love. Some were just stories. The good ones, the embarrassing ones, the ones where she and Marcus had been young and foolish and entirely unprepared for the scale of the life they were building together. She told the story of the first time she had seen Marcus across a crowded room at a structural engineering conference and thought, with complete irrational certainty, "Oh, there you are." She told the story of the day Daniel was born, the specific, surreal, overwhelming morning, and the way Marcus had held him with the expression of a man who has just understood, for the first time, what he was built for. She told the story of the first time Grace had laughed aged 6 weeks, in response to absolutely nothing, eyes scrunched shut, and how the two of them had stood over the crib completely undone, Marcus with his hand over his mouth trying not to make noise, Jessica laughing silently with tears coming down her face for reasons she still couldn't fully articulate. She told these stories to a camera in an empty sitting room, and she tried to put into them every particle of love she possessed. On a Thursday evening in late January, Jessica sat in the children's playroom after Daniel and Grace had gone to bed. This was the room where it had begun, in a way the conversation she had overheard, Grace's small specific fear, Daniel's careful answer. You put the important things somewhere they can find them. She sat in the low reading chair she had bought when Daniel was 5, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of a decade of childhood books, spine cracked from repeated reading, drawings taped to the walls, the particular happy chaos of a room that has been genuinely lived in. She had been thinking that week about what Janet had said at the family dinner 9 years ago, a throwaway comment after too much wine, one of those remarks that lodges under the skin and stays there. "You've built yourself a perfect little life, haven't you, Jess? Very impressive, very complete." There had been something in the word complete that had always bothered her, as though a life were a project with a final state, as though the goal were to arrive somewhere finished. But sitting in the playroom in January, with the memory archive growing on a laptop in the sitting room and her children asleep upstairs, and the frost on the magnolia trees outside, Jessica understood with the kind of understanding that doesn't announce itself but simply arrives, quietly, between one breath and the next, that she had been wrong to be bothered by it. Not because Janet had been right, but because the word complete had never applied in the way Janet had meant it. Her life wasn't complete. It was continuous. It was layered and ongoing and interwoven with other lives in ways that would outlast her own memory of having woven them. The archive was not a monument to what she was losing. It was a bridge built with letters and handwriting and recorded voices and lamb stew recipes and Grace's camera and Daniel's careful letters to his future self, between what was and what would be. Between the woman she was now and the children they would become. She would forget things. She knew that. The illness would come, eventually, for the details and then the larger shapes, and then she allowed herself to know this in the quiet room, with the magnolia trees outside, perhaps for the names, for the faces, for the specific weight of her children in her arms. But what she was building would not forget. The letters would not forget. The videos would not forget. Maria would not forget, nor Franklin, nor Oliver, nor Ruth, who had retrieved the birthday box, nor the magnolia trees themselves, which had witnessed everything. And Daniel and Grace, Daniel with his careful, steady love, and Grace with her open-handed, undisguised joy, they would carry it all forward, not as a burden, as a foundation. Jessica reached out and straightened a drawing on the wall, Grace's drawing of the family, done in the particular hieroglyphic style of a 9-year-old. Stick figures with enormous heads and flowers growing at their feet, and a sun with a face in the corner, beaming down on all of it with the uncomplicated cheerfulness of a child who believes in their bones that the universe is fundamentally on their side. She's right, Jessica thought. It is. She turned off the playroom light, walked upstairs, checked on her children, Daniel a still shape beneath his astronomy duvet, Grace curled around her stuffed elephant with her mother's photograph tucked beside the pillow, and went to bed. In the morning, she would record another video. She had a story she hadn't told yet, the one about the day she had planted the magnolia trees, the day the twins were born, the specific and extraordinary ordinary morning when she had looked at her life and understood, for the first time, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She would tell it to the camera, in the afternoon light, with her hands resting in her lap and her voice steady and unhurried. And when the day came that her children needed it most, when they were older, or alone, or facing something they hadn't expected, or simply missing her in the particular wordless way that people miss the ones who shaped them, they would press play. And she would be there, exactly as she had always been, present, specific, unafraid, and entirely, irreversibly theirs. The greatest gift a mother can leave is not what she gives her children, but what she teaches them to give each other. Please subscribe, like, share, turn on notifications so you never miss a story. The END and EXT.